I think it is an obvious first principle of metaphysics. Being does not come from non-being. Something does not come from nothing. Atheists themselves recognize this truth. For example, David Hume wrote to John Stuart, "I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. I only maintained that our certainty of the falsehood of that proposition proceeded neither from intuition nor demonstration, but from another source."
Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well and that your intuitive spidey senses are tingling. For today we're going to deep dive into stage 1 of the old Kalam.
Oh boy!
More specifically, myself and the infinitely talented Joe Schmid from the Majesty of Reason are going to be focusing on the intuitive argument in favour of the causal principle, which constitutes the first premise. That
whatever begins to exist has a cause.
But first, let's get this train back on the rails. It's been 8 months since we published our first video in this series, but we assure you that the delay between this episode and the next won't be nearly as long. We are pulling no punches and doing everything within our finite ability to create the best online Kalam resource to date, and for this episode, there's a lot of stations, a lot of literature. Also, until recently, Joe's been busy studying with the Avengers, and without him in the driving seat, this series wouldn't be a quarter of what it's going to be. Honestly, this dude lives and breathes metaphysics, and so please, if you get something out of this, be sure to subscribe to the Majesty of Reason. Joe is going places, and if you subscribe, he'll take you along for the ride. Lastly, in our first episode, we said that our second episode, this episode, will
focus on stage 1 of what we'll call the Old Kalam. In particular, we'll focus on the causal principle, as well as the purported scientific support for the universe's beginning from Big Bang cosmology.
However, we've since decided to dedicate independent episodes to each argument. Because, and to be transparent, let's say that you're interested in the argument from chaos.
You don't think, do you, that things can just pop into existence uncaused?
Well, first and foremost, you might not ever find an episode in which we tackle it since our video won't have the relevant SEO. That is, it won't sufficiently target the keywords that you're searching. And secondly, if you did find it, you'd bounce after digesting the segment. And of course, why wouldn't you? Your interest was with the argument from chaos, not, for instance, Andrew Loke's modus tollens argument.
The modus tollens arguments.
But your bounce would, unfortunately, negatively impact the video's retention, which is a big no-no in YouTube land. So yeah, great news. You're going to get more videos, more memes, and more beautiful thumbnails.
Hey peeps, yes, I know, I'm now twice the age I was in the first video, but we're just going to ignore that. So, as Steven said, our focus in this video is going to be premise 1 of stage 1 of the Old Kalam. Recall from our first video that the Kalam has 2 stages. Stage 1 aims to infer at least one first cause of the universe, whereas stage 2 aims to infer important divine attributes of the entity arrived at in stage 1. Also recall that the Kalam comes in different forms, most notably the Old Kalam and New Kalam. The New Kalam relies on causal finitism, whereas the Old Kalam doesn't. The Old Kalam's causal principle, moreover, relies on a variety of arguments, including the argument from intuition, which is what we're going to focus on here. Finally, recall the Old Kalam itself. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. But before delving into the argument from intuition, let's get really clear on what precisely the Kalam's first premise is saying. We need to understand 3 basic concepts before assessing premise 1. Existence, begins to exist, and cause. So, how exactly is existence defined? Well, it's widely recognized that existence is notoriously difficult to define. Roughly, however, a given thing X exists so long as that thing is in reality. That is, there is such a thing as X. By the way, I put on this shirt just to explain existence. That means there exists an X, and that little backwards E, that's called the existential quantifier. But, of course, when I wear the shirt, it's more appropriately called the sexistential quantifier.
That was more like the look.
Okay. Moving on, what about begins to exist? Here's an easy way to understand it. Something begins to exist when it exists at some time and didn't exist prior to that time. Or in other words, something's life, so to speak, has an earliest temporal boundary. For instance, the Earth began to exist around 4.54 billion years ago. Joe began to exist around 21 years ago. And an event like a football match begins to exist when the whistle blows.
To the Arsenal 1-0. To the Arsenal. This is so cringe.
So, if it's not clear by now, Joe has somewhat of an affiliation with Arsenal, and so I'm just going to be a good friend and remind him that they're currently 4th in the Premier League. Yeah, there's not 1, not 2, but 3 teams in front of them.
Another beautifully worked goal!
Anyhow, there are more precise and philosophically respectful ways of cashing out what it means to say that something begins to exist, and we should have these on our radar. William Lane Craig offers the following analysis specific to the tense theory of time. By the way, tense theories of time say that there are objective, mind-independent, non-relative facts about what is past, present, and future, and these facts are called tensed facts. Here, then, is Craig's analysis of begins to exist. Where x ranges over any entity, and t ranges over times, whether instants or moments of non-zero finite duration, A. X begins to exist at t if and only if x comes into being at t, and b. X comes into being at t if and only if 1. X exists at t and the actual world includes no state of affairs in which x exists timelessly, 2. T is either the first time at which x exists, or is separated from any t prime which is earlier than t at which x existed by an interval during which x does not exist, and 3. X's existing at t is a tensed fact. Or as Craig expresses in simpler terms, the key criterion for determining if something has a beginning is its past metrical finitude. Something has a beginning just in case the time during which it existed is finite.
Now let's define cause. So the notion of cause at play here is what philosophers call an efficient cause, and for simplicity we'll just use the term cause. So something causes something else just in case the former produces or brings about the latter. Or, put more succinctly, x causes y just in case x produces or brings about y. In this case, x is the cause and y is the effect. For example, my kicking the soccer ball causes the ball to fly off. Other examples include smoking causes lung cancer, watching this epic Kalam series causes you to experience profound happiness and delight, and so on. Now, there's lots of controversy over what causation is. Is it a relation only between events? Does it also or only relate objects or substances? Is it reducible to other features of reality? Is it essentially spatiotemporal? Well, we'll return to some of these questions later in the series. For now, we just need a basic understanding of the concept. The final thing needing clarification is the characterization of premise 1, that is, the Kalam's causal principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause. For starters, we should avoid characterizing the denial or negation of premise 1 in a misleading way. Someone who denies premise 1 but accepts premise 2 might hold that the universe began to exist without a cause. But sometimes defenders of the Kalam equate the denial of premise 1 with the suggestion that once upon a time, prior to the existence of the universe, there was a situation or state in which nothing at all, not even time, existed. And then out of that black hole of nothingness, the universe popped into existence. To be sure, this is nonsense. There is no time at which there is no time, and if there were nothing at all, there would of course be nothing at all, not even a popping into existence. Nor is there a state of nothingness from which the universe could arise. But such absurdities are not entailed by the simple denial of the proposition that the beginning of the universe has a cause. To deny premise 1 is not to say that something can come from a prior state of non-being or nothingness. Instead, to deny premise 1 is simply to say that something can begin to exist without being caused to do so. Well, I just realized that I didn't change my shirt back, so on to that. What we learn from this clarification is that advocates of the Kalam would do well to avoid talking about the impossibility of something coming into existence out of sheer nothingness. It's a source of potential confusion, and it adds nothing to the case for premise 1. Note, though, that we will occasionally use the locutions pop or spring into existence within our series simply because, first, we'll occasionally follow the way that advocates of the Kalam themselves speak,
That things can just pop into existence uncaused.
and, second, because it's sometimes linguistically simpler and less chunky. Less chunky. And second, because it's sometimes linguistically simpler and less clunky than more accurate and precise alternatives. Just keep this note in mind whenever you hear it throughout our series.
Our second clarification is that not every version of the Kalam contains the unrestricted causal principle that absolutely everything that begins to exist has a cause. Some versions say instead simply that if our universe began to exist, then our universe has a cause. Craig, for instance, tends to favour this restricted principle when debating physicists, such as Sean Carroll. Other versions are restricted in other ways. However, we will focus on the unrestricted causal principle for two reasons. First, it's by far the most commonly used causal principle in Kalam discussions. And secondly, if the unrestricted causal principle is false, that is, if at least one thing can come into existence uncaused, then it becomes unclear why we should believe the more restricted versions of the principle. So, with the background concepts defined and the characterization of premise 1 clarified, it's time to lean on our chunky intuition. It is argued by many proponents of the Kalam that the causal principle, that is, premise 1, just seems intuitively obvious. William Lane Craig writes, "First and foremost, the principle is rooted in the metaphysical intuition that something cannot come into being from nothing, for to come into existence without a cause of any sort is to come into being from nothing. To suggest that things can just pop into being uncaused out of nothing is to quit doing serious metaphysics and to resort to magic. Nobody sincerely believes that things, say a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause." Now, we've already seen why the language of coming from nothing and popping into existence out of nothing is misleading. But set this aside. Craig's contention here is that premise 1 is supported by its intuitive obviousness.
Before evaluating this, we need to understand how philosophers use the term intuition. As philosophers John Bankson, Terence Cuneo, and Russ Schaefer-Landau point out, an intuition is a conscious, non-sensory mental state or event in which it strikes one that things are a certain way when one reflects on the matter. So, intuitions aren't gut feelings or suspicions or instincts or anything like that. Instead, they are intellectual seemings. That is, ways things seem to you upon reflection. For example, when considering whether the fact that x is identical to y and y is identical to z implies the fact that x is identical to z, it might strike you that the answer is clearly and obviously yes. The same holds for the intuition that nothing could be colored without being a particular shade of color, that contradictions are impossible, and that believing against all evidence is irrational. To be sure, one or more of these claims may turn out to be false, and we may fail to believe or judge that one or more of them are true. But that's compatible with each of them being intuited. That is, with each of them striking us as if their truth is manifest or clear. Now, intuitions aren't infallible, but it's plausible that they provide at least some support for the intuited claims. This support is defeasible. That is, it can, in principle, be overturned or overridden by countervailing considerations or reasons. But it's still support nonetheless. To see this, consider that scientific knowledge rests on intuitions. Scientists use tons of logic and mathematics in their experimentation and theorizing, and our logical and mathematical knowledge is based on the intuitive obviousness of certain logical and mathematical truths. For instance, it seems obvious that if P is true and P implies Q, then Q is true. We don't need to know this by sophisticated chains of reasoning or sophisticated experimental techniques. Instead, we can intuitively see that it must be true. Similarly, scientists rely on seemings in making measurements and observations. The scientist concludes that the pressure in their experimental system is 14 atmospheres because it seems that there's a pressure gauge in front of them that reads 14 atmospheres. Other scientists can repeat this measurement, of course, but they too will be relying on its seeming to be the case that there is a pressure gauge in front of them that reads 14 atmospheres. In short, if we couldn't trust seemings, science would be impossible. But back to the causal principle. Remember, according to Craig, it's intuitively obvious that nothing can spring into existence without some cause. Given that intuitions provide some support for the intuited claims, it follows that premise 1 is justified, at least in the absence of good reasons for thinking it's false, or for thinking that the intuition is misguided. And at least for those who share Craig's intuition here. So, with this on the table, let's now consider 5 responses to the argument from intuition.
One response to the argument from intuition is to point out that intuitions are unreliable. That is, they don't tend to produce true beliefs. After all, lots of things that people have found intuitive, such as the Earth's flatness, have turned out to be dead wrong. And if intuition is unreliable, then intuition doesn't support premise 1. In response, recall again that intuitions aren't infallible. Yes, sometimes claims that strike us as clearly true end up being false, but this just means that intuitions don't decisively prove anything. Yet it would be a far too hasty generalization to say that all intuition is unreliable from the fact that some or even many intuitions have turned out to be false. After all, many beliefs based on perceptual experience, ranging from illusions, hallucinations, and so on, have turned out to be false, but clearly we shouldn't conclude from this that all perception is unreliable.
To further flesh out this response, consider again the case of the Earth's flatness. We can grant that lots of people found this intuitively obvious, and perhaps still find it intuitively obvious. But it's crucial to see that the reasons for thinking it's false themselves rely on intuitions. We've performed experiments and made observations that show that the Earth is round, and those experiments and observations rest on a basic trust of our intuitions. Without trusting our logical and mathematical intuitions, such as the intuition that the Earth can't be both flat and round at the same time and in the same respect, or indeed that there is an external world at all, we wouldn't be able to justify drawing inferences about the Earth's shape from our observations. What's more, this very response to Craig's appeal to intuition rests on intuitions. The idea behind the response is something like, 1. We know from experience that lots of our past beliefs based on intuitive obviousness are entirely mistaken. 2. If premise 1 is true, then intuition isn't reliable. So, conclusion 3, intuition isn't reliable.
But why should we conclude that 3 follows from 1 and 2? Even if we grant that 1 and 2 are true, why should we conclude 3? Ultimately, at bedrock, the reason we think that 3 follows from 1 and 2 is that this is simply obvious or self-evident. Note that it won't help to offer another argument for why 1 and 2 allows us to conclude 3, since that very argument will simply raise the exact same question. Why think the conclusion follows from the premises? In the end, we have to appeal to the obviousness of the inference rule to allow us to infer the conclusion from the premises.
It should be noted, though, that while there probably won't be a good argument that intuition is unreliable full stop, there could in principle be a good argument that intuition is unreliable in certain specific domains or conditions. We know, for instance, that while perception in general is reliable, there are certain domains, like in the dark, and conditions, like being drunk, in which perception isn't reliable.
2 shots of vodka.
Thus, another path one could take in responding to Craig's appeal to intuition is that, while intuition is generally reliable, Craig is applying them in a certain domain or in certain conditions for which we have good reason to think intuition isn't reliable. For instance, courtesy of general relativity, we have good reason to doubt lots of our temporal intuitions, and courtesy of quantum mechanics, we have good reason to doubt lots of our causal intuitions. We won't explore these issues further for purposes of space, but suffice it to note for now that if the detractor can justify why intuition is unreliable in certain domains or conditions, and why the intuition in question is in one such domain or condition, then they'll have defeated Craig's appeal to intuition.
A second response to Craig's appeal to intuition is to argue that intuition doesn't, after all, support the causal principle. Philosopher Wes Morriston argues this precisely in his article, "Must the Beginning of the Universe Have a Personal Cause?" To show that a priori intuition doesn't support the causal principle, he examines 2 marks or signs of propositions supported by a priori intuition and argues that it's not at all clear that the causal principle satisfies them. One mark or sign of a proposition supported by a priori intuition is that once someone grasps it, they see that it must be true. The proposition has a type of luminosity or clarity that makes it impossible, or at the very least, very difficult for them not to believe it. A standard example of a proposition knowable this way is that the surface of an object cannot be both red all over and partly green at one and the same time. If somebody doesn't see that this proposition is true, we'll probably suspect that they haven't paid proper attention, or that they simply don't understand it yet. Once they come to grasp it, though, we expect them to see its truth.
A second marker sign of a proposition supported by a priori intuition is that the better acquainted we are with the intuited proposition, that is, the more fully we see what it says and just what is involved in asserting it, the clearer it will be to us that the proposition must be true. It shouldn't be the case that making distinctions necessary to understand the proposition simply makes it more obscure and less certain. Importantly, contends Morriston, the causal principle doesn't satisfy these 2 conditions, or at least it's not clear whether it does. And in that case, it's unclear whether it's supported by a priori intuition. And if that's true, the appeal to intuition in favor of the causal principle fails.
So let's examine Morriston's claim that the causal principle doesn't satisfy the first condition. Is it the case that when we grasp the causal principle, we see that it must be true? For Morriston, it's not at all clear that this is the case. Almost everyone who considers the proposition that the surface of an object cannot be both red all over and partly green at one and the same time sees that this has to be true, whereas lots of people, many of them philosophers, report no such intuition of the causal principle's claim. Indeed, many have the intuition that the causal principle is not necessarily true. For instance, many philosophers think they can perfectly well conceive of a world in which things come into existence without causes. In fact, as long as it doesn't happen too often, it could be a world much like the one that actually exists. And while conceivability doesn't strictly imply possibility, many philosophers think that, intuitively, the ability to conceive something without apparent contradiction is evidence, albeit defeasible evidence, for its possibility. What this tells us is that many philosophers not only don't share the intuition behind the causal principle, but also positively possess intuitions conflicting with it.
Now let's examine Morrison's case that the causal principle doesn't satisfy the second condition. Is it the case that the better we understand the causal principle, the clearer it is that it cannot be false? Again, for Morrison, it's not at all clear that this is the case. For starters, deeper reflection on, and better understanding of, causation arguably leaves the causal principle less clearly true. Must causes precede their effects in time? Must causes bear some temporal relation to their effects? Must causal events be governed by laws? How we answer these questions will influence how plausible we think the causal principle is. And these questions don't have easy, obvious answers. Moreover, if we consider origins of universes, or of times prior to which there are no times, Morrison writes that I have no intuition about what causal principles would have to hold in a situation so remote from ordinary life. When I compare the beginning of time itself to the particular beginnings within time of which I have experience, I can only say, God knows, I don't.
Thus, for Morrison, the more fully we understand and appreciate what is involved in the causal principle, the less obvious it is that it's a necessary truth. By contrast, nothing like this happens when we examine the claim that something can't be both red all over and somewhat green. The more carefully we consider that proposition, the clearer it is that it must be true. So it's not at all clear that the causal principle satisfies two important criteria for determining whether a proposition is supported by a priori intuition. If Morrison is right about this, then Craig's argument from intuition fails. As icing on top of the cake, Morrison concludes that anyone who claims to have an a priori intuition of premise 1 must be prepared to explain why other equally well-informed and intelligent persons who have attended closely to one, made all the relevant distinctions, and clearly understood what it says, nevertheless fail to see that it is true. If it is so obvious, how can they fail to see it?
How might the proponent of the argument from intuition respond to Morrison? Well, they might argue that his methodology here is simply flawed. He compares the causal principle to a truth like the surface of an object cannot be both red all over and partly green at one and the same time. And he finds that the causal principle lacks the self-evidence and perspicuity of this truth. But this seems to assume that all intuitively grasped, metaphysically necessary truths are alike in their self-evidence and perspicuity. But that just isn't true. Such propositions have varying degrees of self-evidence and perspicuity. For example, the claim that if change exists, then time exists is an intuitively obvious necessary truth, but it arguably doesn't enjoy the self-evidence or perspicuity of Morrison's red and green example. And like the notion of cause, the notions of change and time are fraught with interesting philosophical puzzles with non-obvious answers. Thus, the further we reflect on and understand this proposition, the less clearly true it may become. But that doesn't mean we aren't justified in accepting it by dint of its intuitive obviousness. Moreover, most people grant that the claim, torturing a child just for fun is wrong, must be true on the basis of its intuitive obviousness. But it's at least conceivable that there's a world in which actions like torture lack the property of wrongness. And even if we grant that conceivability provides defeasible evidence for possibility, what we need to do here is compare the plausibility of the respective claims, and, all else being equal, side with the one that strikes us as more plausible. And, at least according to defenders of the argument from intuition, the claim that whatever begins to exist has a cause enjoys greater plausibility than that lent to the claim that some things can begin to exist uncaused by the defeasible evidence of its conceivability.
Finally, recall Morrison's question that iced the top of the cake. If the causal principle is so obvious, how can lots of honest, intelligent, and well-informed people fail to see its truth upon reflection? But perhaps Morrison is afflicted with an equally pressing question. If the causal principle isn't intuitively obvious, how can lots, indeed arguably the majority of honest, intelligent, and well-informed people seem to see its truth upon reflection?
We aren't able to settle this particular dispute here. We want to give you guys the tools to think critically about the causal principle so that you can make up your own mind on the matter. Don't just take our word. Use the lights of reason and experience to test out premise 1 for yourself. That's how we become responsible, independent, critical thinkers.
A third response to the argument from intuition is that lots of principles that contradict the Kalam are equally supported by intuition. As Wes Morriston writes, different intuitions pull us in different directions. Some may support the traditional theistic picture of creation, but others don't. In particular, I think that creation out of nothing is at least as counterintuitive as beginning to exist without a cause. When I try to conjure up a picture of something, a house, say, popping into existence without a cause, it does seem absurd. Houses don't just materialize out of nothing, they have to be built. But I don't see how considerations of this sort can be appealed to by someone who believes in creatio ex nihilo. After all, a house popping into existence out of nowhere doesn't seem any less absurd just because someone says or thinks, let there be a house where there was no house.
Now, in response to Morriston's principle denying creation ex nihilo, one might say that God is omnipotent, and so of course he could do such a thing. But this response is entirely unsatisfactory, since omnipotence is restricted to the ability only to do what's possible. And yet, whether creation ex nihilo is possible is the very question at issue here. And indeed, intuition seems to strongly tell against its possibility. In short, the absence of a material cause seems at least as troubling as the absence of an efficient cause. At the level of raw intuition, the idea of something beginning without an efficient cause doesn't seem more absurd than that of somebody making a universe out of absolutely nothing. What we learn from this is that if we assume that the Kalam, if successful, shows that all of material reality had a beginning and that such a beginning must have been caused ex nihilo, then accepting the Kalam would entail denying an intuitively obvious principle. In turn, accepting the principle entails rejecting the Kalam. But, crucially, there doesn't seem to be any reason for preferring the intuition that whatever begins to exist has a cause over the intuition that whatever begins to exist is made out of pre-existent stuff. If we accept the former, then it seems we should accept the latter. But, as we've seen, accepting the latter entails rejecting the Kalam. Hence, if we should accept the intuition allegedly supporting the Kalam's first premise, then we should reject the Kalam. It seems then that defenders of the Kalam must either reject the intuition that supports the first premise, or else reject the Kalam itself.
There is, though, a third option for defenders of the Kalam. In particular, they could try to show why we should prefer the intuition that everything that begins to exist has a cause over the intuition that everything that begins to exist is made of pre-existing stuff. But firstly, this won't be an easy task, and secondly, there are lots of other principles that are both deeply intuitive and incompatible with the Kalam. It's going to be exceedingly difficult to show, for each such principle, that we should prefer the Kalam principle over it. And it's going to be even harder to show that we should prefer the Kalam principle over the disjunction of all these other Kalam incompatible principles. Here are just a few other principles that seem intuitively plausible, but that are either incompatible with the Kalam or with traditional theism. 2. Every material object that begins to exist has a material cause, i.e. some things or stuff from which it is made. Now, note that this is distinct from Morriston's principle, since principle 2 is restricted to material objects. Morriston's principle, by contrast, applies to the creation of anything material. Also note that there are similar principles in the vicinity. Philosopher Felipe Leon defends the principle of material causality, which states that every concrete object with an originating or sustaining cause has a material cause, in the sense of some things or stuff from which it is made. For us, though, we're focused on principle 2 as stated.
Now, principle 2 seems deeply plausible. If you discovered a log cabin in the woods and its owner told you that they made the log cabin without any material whatsoever, no wood, no logs, no nails, no plaster, no mortar, no mud, you would think they've gone insane. And if we assume that the Kalam, if successful, shows that all of material reality had a beginning, and that such a beginning must have been caused ex nihilo, then the Kalam would imply that the universe is a material object that begins to exist without a material cause. Hence, this intuitive principle is incompatible with the Kalam.
To be sure, Cray considers something analogous to this principle in his work. One thing he says in response is that the principle may simply be overridden by the arguments for the finitude of the past. For if it is impossible that there be an infinite regress of past events, it is impossible for the first cause to be a material object, since matter/energy is never quiescent. He continues that we shouldn't then reject the causal principle in addition, for if coming into being without a material cause seems impossible, coming into being with neither a material nor an efficient cause is doubly absurd.
But there are at least 4 problems with Craig's response here. First, we could equally say that the arguments for the finitude of the past may simply be overridden by the intuitive obviousness of principle 2. Second, it's not at all clear that matter/energy is never quiescent. While the matter/energy in our experience is never quiescent, there isn't any clear reason why this must apply categorically to all kinds of matter and energy that there could be, including kinds we've never experienced, such as that which may have existed at or before the beginning of the universe. It's also not clear why this must apply to the kinds of matter we've experienced in all conditions it could find itself in, including conditions far removed from our ordinary experience. In fact, accepting this intuitively obvious principle, along with accepting the arguments for the finitude of the past, may together give one very strong reason to think that some matter can, after all, be quiescent under some conditions. Third, while material cause might suggest matter or energy, notice how we actually defined it. The things or stuff from which something is made. This need not be matter or energy. It might be the case, for instance, that there is some non-material entity that causes the universe to begin to exist by transforming itself in some way, or partitioning itself off in some manner. Alternatively, something else might have transformed it in some manner. This is precisely what, for instance, many panentheists, who deny creation ex nihilo, think is true. God creates ex deus, or out of the resources of his own being, as it were. This is incompatible with traditional theism, of course, but our point is that Craig is wrong to insist that the principle requires that the material cause has to be matter or energy. Fourth, as Wes Morriston argues, Craig's claim about double absurdity just misses the point. I brought up the intuitive absurdity of creatio ex nihilo only in order to suggest that our intuitions about such matters, that is, our intuitions about the conditions required for there to be an absolute beginning of time and matter itself, may not be especially reliable. The fact that Craig himself is forced to take a position that runs counter to one of his own strong intuitions merely reinforces this point.
Here's a third principle that's both deeply intuitive and yet conflicts with the Kalam. 3. Causes must be either before or simultaneous with their effects. Again, this principle seems really plausible. Causation intuitively seems intimately bound up with time. And if we assume that the Kalam, if successful, shows that all of temporal reality had a beginning, and that such a beginning must have been caused by something non-temporal, then the Kalam implies that not all causes are before or simultaneous with their effects. Hence, principle 3 is incompatible with the Kalam. At this point, it's interesting to observe that some of the very philosophers that Craig cites as favouring his own causal principle also hold that causes must precede their effects in time. Take, for instance, David Hume.
In other words, what Hume was saying was that he couldn't prove the causal principle that anything that begins to exist has a cause, but he regarded its denial as metaphysically absurd, and so he believed the principle.
But, of course, David Hume's famous analysis of the causal relation in A Treatise of Human Nature explicitly includes the principle that causes must precede their effects in time. And in another passage quoted by Craig, C.D. Broad says that he cannot believe that anything could begin to exist without being caused by something else which existed before and up to the moment when the existing thing in question began to exist. As Wes Morrison notes in this regard, it is important to see that in order to get the Kalam argument off the ground, Craig must take controversial positions on a number of highly debatable issues having to do with the nature of time and of causation. Contrary to what Craig supposes, therefore, a sane adult may have sincere and quite reasonable doubts about the scope of premise 1 of the Kalam argument.
Now, it should be noted that, according to Craig, this principle is, quote, not at all incompatible with the Kalam argument's conclusion, since its defender may hold that God's act of causing the beginning of the universe is simultaneous with the universe's beginning to exist, end quote. But this is mistaken. For if God's act of causing the beginning of the universe is simultaneous with the universe's beginning to exist, then God's act of causing the beginning of the universe itself began to exist at the first moment of time, and hence, per the Kalam's causal principle, would require a cause. Now, that cause is either timeless or temporal. If it's timeless, then we get the unintuitive result that not all causes are temporally related to their effects. If it's temporal, then it too began to exist, and so requires a cause, per the Kalam's causal principle. We cannot proceed to infinity among such causes, lest Craig admit actual infinites, and hence a cause that isn't temporally related to its effect is unavoidable for the Kalam proponent. Finally, Craig might once again say that the strong intuitive case for Principle 2 is simply overridden by his a priori arguments against the infinite past when they are taken together with the Kalam's causal principle. If every beginning has a cause, and there can be no temporal cause at the beginning of time, then Principle 3 is false. But as Wes Morriston notes, quote, even if Craig's arguments against the infinite past are better than I think they are, this is quite a dangerous line for him to take. For the critic can make precisely the same move, arguing that Kalam's causal principle is quote-unquote simply overridden by the same arguments when they are taken together with principle 3.
A third and final principle we consider is 4. Every case of mental causation is durational, i.e., whenever a mind produces an effect, the mind undergoes some temporal process in doing so. This, too, seems quite intuitive, and yet it's incompatible with the Kalam, since God's mentally causing the beginning of the time couldn't itself presuppose God undergoing some temporal process. Overall, then, the argument from intuition might actually do more harm than good to the Kalam.
A fourth response to the argument from intuition is that the intuition is considerably weakened, if not entirely removed, under the B theory of time. According to the B theory of time, there is no mind-independent, objective temporal becoming or dynamism. Time is in some sense static. There is no progression of things from the past, through the present, and into the future. The B theory of time is often conjoined with a view called four-dimensionalist eternalism, which says that all times, and contents of times, exist. No time is objectively privileged as present or existent. Rather, all times enjoy an equal ontological status. Things are just extended or spread out not only in 3 spatial dimensions, but also across the temporal dimension. Here's how Craig puts the objection from the B theory of time. B theorists deny that in beginning to exist, the universe came into being or became actual. They thereby focus attention on the theory of time underlying the Kalam cosmological argument. From start to finish, the Kalam cosmological argument is predicated upon the A theory of time. On a B theory of time, the universe does not in fact come into being or become actual at the Big Bang. It just exists tenselessly as a four-dimensional spacetime block that is finitely extended in the earlier than direction. If time is tenseless, then the universe never really comes into being, and therefore the quest for a cause of its coming into being is misconceived. There would be no reason to look for a cause of the universe's beginning to exist, since on tenseless theories of time, the universe did not begin to exist in virtue of its having a first event, any more than a meter stick begins to exist in virtue of having a first centimeter.
The key thing to notice is that under the B theory of time, even if the past is finite, the universe doesn't really come into being. It doesn't pop into existence or spring into reality. Instead, the earliest edge of the universe is just statically, unchangingly, and eternally there. To use Craig's analogy, the earliest edge of the universe is analogous to the front end of a ruler. And crucially, the claim that every static, unchanging, earliest temporal boundary has a cause is either not intuitive at all, or, at the very least, its intuitive force is relatively weak. Now, going into a debate between A and B theorists would take us too far afield. Suffice it to note for present purposes that the argument from intuition for the Kalam's first premise needs significant reinforcement, since its intuitive force relies quite heavily on the falsity of the B theory. And yet the B theory is a perfectly respectful position both on philosophical and scientific grounds. Proving it false will be difficult, and hence it will be difficult to mount a successful argument from intuition that relies on its falsity.
Kalam proponents will probably respond that while the B-theory-friendly causal principle that everything with an earliest temporal boundary has a cause might be somewhat less intuitive than the original principle, it's still very intuitively plausible. They might argue that spatial boundaries seem to require causal explanations. It's not as though the boundaries of my laptop, or the Eiffel Tower, or a tree, or a star could exist without any cause whatsoever. Instead, it seems plausible that there's some causal reason why they have the boundaries they do. And given that this is intuitive in the case of spatial boundaries, it likewise seems intuitive in the case of temporal boundaries under B-theoretic eternalism, or so the Kalam proponent might argue.
A fifth and final response to the argument from intuition depends on you. In particular, it depends on whether you share the relevant intuition. Clearly, appeals to a claim's intuitive obviousness won't convince you if you don't even find the claim intuitively obvious. This is one of the limitations of appeals to intuition. If you don't share the intuition, then they really don't do anything for you in terms of giving you a reason to accept the claim in question. So that's yet another way to respond. If you don't share the intuition, the argument from intuition for premise 1 is simply powerless for you. In the context of Abrahamic faith, and in a throwback to Blaise Pascal, you might be just so made as not to believe. Well, you did it, my fellow ape. You made it through the episode, and for that, you are awesome. Before recapping, I have a few announcements and plugs, but I'll keep them brief. First and foremost, Low Fruit has been moved to a channel of its own name, and it's even got a fresh episode ready for you to consume.
I'm glad we're going to hell because we don't understand this.
So if you enjoy my more laid-back content, please do head over. And of course, remember to subscribe. Second, I'd like to give a word to our Lord and Saviour, the Industrial Revolution. That is to say, if you enjoy strategic card games, then why not get your hands on Debunked, my game. You can even hitch slap your friends. And finally, I just want to again recommend Joe Schmid's channel, The Majesty of Reason. If you're into philosophy, and well, if you've got this far, you probably are, you owe it to yourself to hear more of what he has to say. Joe is a brilliant young person. Young person? What? Why does that sound so weird? Joe is a brilliant young ape, and that's even worse, isn't it? Joe is a brilliant individual, and frankly, I consider myself lucky to call him my friend. And with that, let's wrap up. We began by clarifying the terms of the argument, namely existence, begins to exist, and cause. Then we emphasised that denying the causal premise does not mean endorsing creation from nothing, which is, unfortunately, a rather common accusation from Kalam proponents. We then presented the argument from intuition, the holy grail of this video, the intuition that something cannot come into being from nothing. And this is where the rubber met the road. We gave 5 responses, with our first being to point out that intuitions are unreliable. They don't tend to produce true beliefs, and especially when applied to areas far removed from our experience. Drawing from Wes Morriston, our second response was to argue that intuition doesn't, after all, support the causal principle, since it doesn't satisfy the 2 marks of proposition supported by a priori intuition. Sticking with our main man Morriston, for the third response we noted many other intuitive principles that contradict the Kalam and/or theism, and noted the very difficult task issued on the Kalam proponent to explain why we should abandon the disjunction of all of these other Kalam incompatible principles. Our fourth response referred to the B theory of time, and the fact that under the B theory, the causal principle is, at best, significantly weakened. Finally, for our fifth response, we acknowledged the fact that some people simply do not have the intuition that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And if you are such a person, then, trivially, for you, the argument from intuition is dead from the get-go. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and YouTube members. Without the support of ordinary people, people like you, that can afford to buy me a cup of coffee every once in a while in exchange for a video, I simply would not be able to create such content as this. Rather, I'd have to take the tax-free route and assume the identity of an apologist.
That was more like the look.
Joe was right, this is cringe.